Well. It's been weeks since we have done one of these. Since we have talked a little bit about the state of Mythic Plus, the class and spec participation in Mythic Plus, as well as the current week of Mythic Plus and how it is. Do you know what is interesting about this week of Mythic Plus? Nothing. Nothing is interesting about this week of Mythic Plus. What is interesting is that next week is going to be the interesting one because you should get ready. You should get some food and snacks and drinks prepared for next week, because next week is going to be the reset of the Mythic Plus rotation. We went all the way to week 12, which is this current week, Tyrannical, Raging, and Quaking. And next week we are going back to the number 1 week, which is the week with Fortified, Bursting, and Volcanic. For those of you unaware, Fortified, Bursting, and Volcanic is the easiest week out of any possible combination that is currently available in Mythic Plus. This is the essentially easiest week that is going to happen once every 3 months. This is the first time it is repeating. The first time it happened was all the way back to December. It was still the start. People were still doing plus 8s and plus 10s and plus 11s. Now, though, it is much deeper into the progression of Mythic Plus. There are still many people who have, for example, as a goal to get Keystone Master and get all the keys at plus 15, or anyone interested in pushing any level of keys at all should aim at next week as their goal, because it's going to be very, very simple. Much more simple than, for example, this current week or even last week, which was a simple one as well. So, before going back to this week of Mythic Plus in Affixes and whatnot, we're going to have to look at the classes and the specs, because the last time this has been done was actually in week 7. We're talking about over a month ago, so it's time to update ourselves on the current situation we left, and the situation, for example, for tanks as it changed in over a month of changes, in over a month of the population of the game playing. The last time we had 35 something thousand logs of tanks clearing keys at 15 and up. Now we have over 125,000, so we have way more logs now, we have way more entries when it comes to tanks. And no, nothing changed. The lowest played tanks in 15 keys, around 15 and up keys, are still going to be Protection Warrior by a landslide, followed by, not as much of a difference between this one and the closest ones, Blood Death Knight. Brewmaster Monk and Guardian Druid are still somewhat close in the 3rd and 4th position, and then you have Prot Paladin and Vengeance Demon Hunter as the more popular ones, particularly Vengeance Demon Hunter. When you look at the higher level keys, at the plus 20 keys, the situation is also roughly the same. You have Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is still up and above the 66%, so 2 out of 3 tanks of every plus 20 key is going to be a Vengeance, and then the remaining third, the remaining little speck of tanks is going to be divided amongst all of the others. Of course, almost no Protection Warriors and very, very few Blood Death Knights. The more prevalent participation of the other tanks is going to be made up of Brewmaster Monks, Guardian Druids, and Protection Paladin. The only thing that is interesting to point out is that Paladin is essentially losing participation, much like it was reported all those weeks ago. Paladin loses participation the higher the key. You start at 10, and Protection Paladin is actually very close to Vengeance Demon Hunter. Then you go at 10 to 14 keys, and Paladin loses even more, and then you go to 15 and up, 20 and up, and Protection Paladin loses more and more and more. We have already went over the issues of Prot Paladin, their defensiveness, the higher the damage intake goes, and their squishiness, which just doesn't keep up with higher keys, and specs like Guardian Druid and Brewmaster Monk having an easier time dealing with this type of increased damage. We'll have to wait and see, for example, for 9.0.5, if some changes are going to help Protection Paladin. I don't think so, but we will see. When it comes to healers, we had another narrative going on for healers. Restoration Shaman was still standing at the top, and then you had Holy Paladin rising in participation at the higher keys, while at the same time, Restoration Druid was dropping. Now, after a long time of waiting, the plus 15 participation has really not changed that much. I mean, Holy Paladin changes by 0.4%, Discipline Priest changes by 0.3%. The more prevalent change is going to be in 20 keys, where you can see the even bigger change. You can see that now Holy Paladin is getting all the way close to 30% participation, whereas Restoration Druid is going down to 13%. Restoration Shaman is still around the 40% rank. The only thing worth mentioning is that when we talk about the actual high keys, the actual top keys, it is mostly going to be Holy Paladins. I know it seems weird to talk about, but when you start looking at highest keys, it's basically going to be the same 4 to 5 groups running the keys over and over. So at this point, for example, in the top 100 healers of highest keys, there are something like 91 paladins and 8 shamans and 1 discipline priest, At high keys, one of the things that starts becoming a very big issue is going to be damage, for example, and Paladins can bring a lot of it, particularly Holy Paladins going Ventir. Holy Paladins with Ashen Hallow are able to pull off a disgusting amount of DPS, which is something Restoration Shaman cannot do. Also, one of the strongest points of Restoration Shaman when it comes to Mythic Plus is being the retard-proof healer. It's a type of healer that is going to help you the best dealing with mistakes. This is why, particularly, it has such a good representation in Mythic Plus, because lots of pugs are going to be thinking that the healer that is best for their group is Shaman, because you are pugs. You are uncoordinated, you're going to be making lots of mistakes, and Restoration Shaman is the best one at that. Holy Paladins, and even worse, Discipline Priests and even Resto Druids don't have that good and that quick of a way to help people making mistakes dropping to low HP very quickly. They have just 1 or 2 abilities on a longer cooldown than Restoration Shaman that can just chunk off some 20k plus heals in less than 1.5 seconds because of how large their heals are. So the higher you go in keys, this type of playstyle becomes less required, because the higher you go in keys, the more coordinated you are and the better the player. These type of mistakes are not going to happen as much, and more importantly, these type of mistakes are going to one-shot you at certain level of keys hit by certain abilities, so the effectiveness of Restoration Shaman goes much lower, whereas the effectiveness of Holy Paladin and the damage it can bring, even some things like cheesing mechanics, where actually being able to immune certain mechanics becomes very important because of how much damage they end up doing, something that Holy Paladin can do. So this is why, even though technically yes, when it comes to participation overall, at 20 plus is still Shaman, Resto, by a long shot, at the absolute highest, Holy Paladin is more represented. What about melee DPS? Well, nothing really. Melee DPS is pretty much the one that changed the least. I would say it is pretty good though to see this. The representation in 15 and up keys, you happen to have Warrior, Paladin, Rogue, Death Knight, Windwalker, and Havoc, all at or around 10% representation. It is healthy, it is very good to see at least 1 in 10 melee DPS in Mythic Plus being from one of 6 different classes. Yeah, of course, Survival doesn't exist, and Feral doesn't either, and Enhancement is also at half of the rate of the other melee DPS, basically, but it is, as far as participation goes, this looks pretty healthy. It was healthy a month ago. We went 1 month longer, 1 month deeper into the expansion, and the participation is even actually slightly increased, because mostly due to Rogue losing way more participation than before. In over a month, they went from above 17 to below 14, closer to 13, so more space for other specs, more space for other classes. When you look at the plus 20, is the same. Every other spec gets genocided. The only thing interesting to mention is that little brown bar all the way to the left. That brown bar being Fury. It's doing something similar, but not as prevalent and brute force-ish like Windwalker. Windwalker back all those weeks ago, when I was reporting here the rise of Windwalker over time to the point where it passed Unholy, it passed or matched Rogue, and now in plus 20 keys it's actually the only other melee DPS specs brought together with Rogue most of the time. Fury is doing something similar, because Fury just over a month ago was at barely 6%. A month before that it was at barely 3%. Now it's at 11.7. Now it is actually the 3rd most played melee DPS specs at higher keys. It has passed Havoc, it has passed, especially importantly, Unholy Death Knight, falling lower and lower. So that's something worth mentioning. I'm not gonna go into the whole warrior scales meme, because I've made myself clear already, and we will have to see later on. But for now, it does at the very least look like it's doing fine for the moment, especially compared to where it was before. The last one is the range DPS that we should talk about, and something worth mentioning happened. So a month ago, you had the big 3, Marksmanship, Fire, and Balance. It's been a month. What happened? Well, Fire has gone up a little bit, Balance Druid has been pretty much stayed there, and then the only one that changed was Marksmanship, because Marksmanship went from 30% and just 1.5% participation of Beast Mastery to 24.4% and 3% participation of Beast Mastery. So we have gotten less Marksmanship Hunter clocked in plus 15 keys at the expense of more Beast Mastery Hunters and more of the other classes in the range DPS. And then when you go and look at the plus 20 keys, we have another change where Marksmanship Hunter is still sort of lower, from 27.6 to 23.6. This has gotten to the point where Balanced Druid is now routinely out participating Marksmanship Hunter in high keys. Before it was pretty much the opposite, basically. Weeks and weeks ago, it was Marksmanship Hunter that was the more popular one. and then instead it has slowly over time making space for balance and fire. Is this going to continue? Is this going to continue to progress in the obscurity of Marksmanship Hunter, maybe even so for the rise of Beast Mastery Hunter, maybe in the next year? I don't know. I don't think so. Plus, it's probably going to depend on how exactly Blizzard is going to continue the balancing situation. There is only so much that scaling can do for your spec, because of course then Blizzard flies in and completely changes some of your talents or legendaries or whatnot, and you're suddenly much stronger. So that is also going to play a big part on how these specs are going to perform. For now, yes, let's be happy that Marksmanship Hunters are not as dominating as before, but then you look at the rest of the specs and you're like, okay, Shadow Priests, Elemental, Frost, Arcane, and Affliction, and Demonology, and Destruction put together are still less than a half of Marksmanship Hunters. So yeah, that's always going to happen when you look at high keys, unfortunately. Only the best survive, survival of the fittest. Now, looking at a little bit more broadly when it comes to Mythic Plus, looking at the actual affixes of the week for once. So this is a good week, okay? It's not bad. It's not the best or one of the best simply because it's got Tyrannical that ruins things a little bit. It is always a good time to remember, everyone, that Tyrannical has been nerfed. It used to give 40% max HP to bosses, now it gives 30%. So it is also not as bad as before. When you look at Tyrannical, well, the first thing you want to do, by the way, when you look at Tyrannical is, are the other two affixes going to mess with Tyrannical? Are they going to make it harder? For example, Tyrannical, Bolstering, and Storming. It's just going to be Storming in melee. When you're fighting the boss, for the most part, it's not going to do much of anything else. When you look at Tyrannical, Inspiring, and Necrotic, very bad. Very bad because Necrotic is going to play a big part in a Tyrannical boss. There are quite a few bosses that become much harder because of Necrotic. Then you have Tyrannical, Raging, and Explosive. Raging is a non-factor in Tyrannical. Explosive is also not that bad. Tyrannical, Bolstering, and Necrotic is of course the worst week available, again because of Necrotic and also because of Bolstering for packs and Thrash. This week, with Raging and Quaking, of course Raging is a non-factor and Quaking is also very, very simple. So this makes it a favorable week as far as Tyrannical can be, because both of the other affixes are not going to play too big of a role when it comes to dealing with bosses. So when dealing with bosses is not that bad, it's a good start because this is a week which is focused around boss killing with Tyrannical. What about Thrash? How much of these two affixes are going to cock block you in trying to kill Thrash? These are pretty good. These are actually very good because when you're looking at affixes for Thrash clearing, the question should be, how much time are they going to make me waste? How much longer are the Thrash pulls going to be simply because of affixes? For example, Sanguine, that we've just gotten last week. Sanguine has the possibility of making Thrash pull longer because, well, of course they can heal. A bad positioning, trying, for example, to line of sight certain packs can turn into a problem because then the caster mobs are going to wall cover the pools left behind from the melee mobs that you killed, and then gonna heal up, and then there are other, casters and range mobs that are simply not gonna fucking move. So you have to have things like Grips or Ring of Pieces or Thunderstorms to just kick them out, or they heal. So Sanguine, which is among the easier types of affixes, can be one of the annoying affixes that slow your key. You have, of course, Bolstering. Bolstering is not healing per se, but it is adding HP to the mobs, so it's going to make it slower. And when we compare this to what we have this week, it's very good, because Raging is essentially a non-factor when it comes to time loss. Raging is just going to add some more damage to the pool, but for the rest, it's just going to be there. There's going to be kiting, of course. Raging is one of the affixes that is going to incentivize tank kiting, which is already a de facto mainstay of the tank's strategy in Mythic Plus. But when you have something like Raging, when you have something like Necrotic, it's going to make the tank much more willing to run the fuck away. You can heavily neutralize this with things like Druids and Hunters in your group. With a Dispel and Rage, you can bring a Rogue for an extra Dispel and Rage, even though it's on a 25-second cooldown. It can minimize the effectiveness of the affix altogether. And then, of course, the timing cost you have to pay for this is very, very small. It's just more damage to heal or more damage to tank through. When it comes to Quaking, how much time, seriously, is Quaking going to make you lose? Very, very little. It goes in the same basket with other affixes such as Storming, such as Volcanic, such as Explosive. These things don't modify your key whatsoever. They don't add more time. Bolstering, Spiteful, Inspiring, Sanguine, those are things that can increase the time for you that it takes to clear the key, but these two, not at all. So it is, all things considered, a decent push week compared to other Tyrannical keys. As far as Tyrannical keys can go, this is a pretty nice one. It is the better Tyrannical week that we have had since 6 weeks. since over a month and a half. And just, to be precise, it is the best Tyrannical week we have gotten since the nerf of Tyrannical. So you can take advantage of this. Of course, the value of taking advantage in this week is a little bit less, because now you know that next week is going to be the absolute easiest one with Bursting and Volcanic. But still, you should always, diversify yourself. Don't just refuse to run Tyrannical keys and only ever do fortified keys. It can also be fun at the end of the day, playing the game. You could try having fun in Tyrannical keys. Now, I know, much to the surprise of no one, actually, Sanguine Depths is still the hardest of the keys, and Mist of Ternaceae and Halls of Atonement are still the easiest one. We're gonna just leave it at that. When it comes to the easiest ones, they're just there. It's known already. There's not much to say or to point out anymore. We could point out a few things on Sanguine Depths, because before, the hardness of Sanguine Depths was on its own. It was its own tier, it was super difficult and overtuned. After the several round of nerfs, now Sanguine Depths is the hardest one, but it is, a good type of hard, a different and more acceptable type of hard. This week in particular, of course, makes it more painful because it's Tyrannical, and Sanguine Depths is a nasty key when it comes to Tyrannical. Not just because the boss is hard, but because the bosses are hard, because Crixis, which is the first boss, and then Tarvold, and then even Berilla, and then Khal, they're all annoying bosses and difficult bosses. They could be, the toughest point of another random dungeon. Just one of them. You could go to Mist of Ternaceae and put Crixis as the last boss, the hardest boss of the entire key and the problem of the key. And then you take Tarvold and you make it the last boss of Spires of Ascension, and that would be the hardest boss of the dungeon. That's how annoying all of these bosses are. Without Fortified, it's going to be pretty easy to go through the trash. You just have to manage the boss fights, which are not going to be as hard as other Tyrannical weeks, because as we pointed out, the current two affixes coming together with Tyrannical don't really do anything in the boss fights. The more interesting part is always in the middle, when you have the other dungeons sort of switching around. We can say after now a few weeks, I think it's the 4th week, this one, that Necrotic Quake has been severely nerfed, that now it is among the easiest dungeons. This is, a sensational sentence to make after 3 months of the expansion, something that you would have never thought of hearing just a few months ago. Necrotic Quake is easy, but there is only so much nerfing that a dungeon can take before it breaks, and Necrotic Quake is broken. I guess some people would say for the good, for the better, because it's a simple dungeon now. Many of the mechanics are still there. Many of the annoyances that used to wipe you and give you PTSDs just a few weeks ago are still there. They just do less. They just hit for less, so you can survive them now and you can continue the dungeon. There is also the glorious change regarding not losing the Kyrian weapons when you die, so it makes it even better, or rather even faster, to continue the key and the dungeon. Of course, when you have to look at these dungeons and you have to apply their difficulty rating to something like affix by affix situations, with Quaking, of course, the status is space. How much space do you have to actually manage the Quaking? The more open the room, the more wide the area, the easier and a non-issue Quaking becomes. So, of course, Mist is very wide, Halls of Atonement is very wide, except for the last, very, very last part. Necrotic Quake is also very large throughout the entire ground floor zone. The Necropolis is a little bit more tight, but the more you clear, essentially the wider area you have to move around. You have Plagueful, which is also very wide, you have Spires of Ascension, and then you have the tighter ones. You have Other Side, Theater of Pain, and Sanguine Depths. Other Side has a few corridors here and there where Quaking can become annoying, and then you have Theater of Pain and Sanguine Depths, which are also, coincidentally, the harder dungeons, are packed with quite a few narrow corridors, making Quaking harder. Of course, Quaking is easy, but there is also, different layers of easy when you want to gauge the difficulty of dungeons. And this week, the Quaking is becoming more annoying for Theater of Pain and Sanguine Depths. One of the mainstay key reasons why Sanguine Depths has been so hard for all these weeks is because even when you have shit easy affixes, they are made harder in Sanguine Depths because of things like spacing, space, room. Something that is not an issue in most of the other dungeons becomes a problem in Sanguine Depths. Like Sanguine, like Quaking, like Storming, all this shit which is usually pointless in other dungeons, you just ignore it, it's not that difficult. In Sanguine Depths, it becomes an actual legit annoyance. And similar, but to a much more manageable level, Theater of Pain, which also happens to have quite a few corridors, quite a few small platforms for the Kultarok fight, it's also pretty annoying. Talking about Theater of Pain, it is in an interesting situation because it has been nerfed, much like many of the other dungeons, but not as hard as quite a few others. It hasn't been nerfed as hard as Necrotic Wake, as the Other Side, as Plagueful, and as Spires of Ascension. Theater of Pain was in that zone, in the middling zone with all the other 5, dungeons in the middle, wrestling for positions, every tyrannical or fortified tyrannical or fortified week, depending. But now, Theater of Pain has been solidified itself as one of the hardest dungeons together with Sanguine Depths. As mentioned, it's not as hard as Sanguine Depths, which is still the hardest, but because of the essentially more major nerfs, more important nerfs to the other dungeons, Theater of Pain is now tough, all of a sudden tougher. The same, tough parts of Theater of Pain are still there. You have the Goltarok platforms, which can become very nasty in certain weeks, in certain affixes. Of course, in Fortify they are much worse. Now they are way more manageable. You have certain bosses. You have Gore Chop, and then you have the last boss, Mordreta, which can become pretty nasty in Tyrannical like this week, although both have been nerfed. The Quaking, as mentioned, is among the more annoying for dungeons together with Sanguine Depths. And then there is Raging. Raging is another issue in Theater of Pain, more so than other dungeons. Why? Because Theater of Pain happens to have quite a few big mobs. Thick mobs with lots of HP. Thick mobs with lots of HP means a much more threatening Raging. Of course, the smaller mobs are more dangerous because there is more of them. So you're gonna proc Enrage on 5 of them at the same time if you're AoEing them down. But if the tank is kiting, if you are CCing them, and because they have low HP, they die fast enough that it doesn't become an issue. But when you're fighting against a fat guy with lots of HP that gets raging, it's much more dangerous, much more threatening, and also because usually those big guys are much harder to kite. Usually they have some sort of anti-kite mechanic, which means you have to face tank the raging. Of course, this is where Soothe comes in. This is when Tranquilizing Shot comes in, so it makes it a much more manageable affix. But this is not always going to happen. Sometimes the party leader is masochistic. There's not going to be a druid in the group. There's not going to be a hunter in the group. You're going to have to deal with the raging. And when you have to deal with the raging, then Theater of Pain is a particularly hard dungeon with this affix. This leaves you with the other easier ones in the middle. Not as easy as the more nerfed dungeon like Narcotic Wake, and not as hard as the current harder dungeons, which are the other side, Plaguefall and Spires of Ascension. And they just fall here because of this reason, really. They're not as easy as Narcotic Wake, but at the same time, not really as hard as Theater of Pain. The quaking in this dungeon is not an issue because they are open and wide enough in the areas that you're going to be fighting in, that quaking is a non-factor. And then raging is also not that big of a deal in these dungeons. If we really had to go, one by one, position by position, then Spires of Ascension is on the easier side because it's a tyrannical week, and Spires of Ascension is not that difficult when it comes to bosses. And then at the other side, not a pun, not intended, at the other side we have the other side, because it is a tyrannical focus key on tyrannical, which makes it more challenging. And in the middle we have Plagueful, which used to be very tough on trash mobs, and then it was nerfed, and then it was pretty dangerous still on bosses because of Domina and Stradama, and then they also got nerfed. Now it's sort of there in the middle. It's not as threatening as it was before. This is something that is pretty much worth saying for all of the dungeon after the nerfs, but for Plagueful it is particularly so. One of the things that is worth mentioning on Plagueful that we haven't mentioned when it comes to the changes that Blizzard plans to add is that on Domina Venomblade, you are no longer going to get necrotic stacks when it comes to the assassins throwing the daggers at you from stealth. I just wanted to throw it out there. Pretty good change, which we're going to see the next time we're going to stumble on Plagueful Necrotic. The next time we're going to stumble in Plagueful Necrotic is actually going to be in about a month, in about 5 weeks. So remember, in 5 weeks, that there's going to be a nerf. All in all, the state of the dungeon right now has sort of solidified this way, with Mists and Halls of Atonement among the easiest ones, and Theater of Pain and Sanguine Depths in the hardest role, in the hardest category, with the other dungeon now taking place for the middle. Necrotic Quake is going to be more likely stay at the just below the easiest ones, followed by the Mad Fight in the middle, depending on the affixes, the weekly affixes. The other side, Plaguefall and Spires of Ascension. So now you have your current situation when it comes to dungeons, and that was just about it. We are actually done. We can call it a day. We have gone over this current week Mythic Plus. More importantly, remind everyone that next week is going to be the real big push week if you're interested in getting to whatever you want to get in Mythic Plus. Get prepared for that. Not too many surprises when it comes to the representation. Some things have remained as they were proceeding, Windwalker Monk becoming more and more popular and staying there after they got there. You have Holy Paladin as well, overtaking, and now officially, stably overtaking Restoration Druid. There is the rise, unsuspecting and surprising rise of Fury Warrior in Mythic Plus compared to before, and nothing really much moving when it comes to tanks, unfortunately. But Blizzard, as we have seen, as we have reported, they have some nerfs lined up for 9.0.5 regarding Vengeance Demon Hunter, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But for the time being, I'm gonna call it a day. I'm gonna leave and abandon you again. We're gonna see each other very likely tomorrow. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, 137492.